Hello everyone, I am Stefano Barone, a statistics professor at the University of Palermo and an aeronautical engineer. Today I am presenting a final update of my study, Bayesian rules in Bayesian disaster, which is still a rapidly evolving issue. The latest news regarding developments in the Bayesian case has prompted me to further reflect on the thesis I've supported so far, leading me to this further digression, which I share publicly. Let's take stock of the situation. The Termini Imerese prosecutor's office, charged with investigation the sinking of the Bayesian ship, which, as we know, resulted in 7 deaths and an eighth one during the recovery of the wreck, has announced, and not yet publishing the document, that the expert assessment conducted by court-appointed technicians has confirmed that the weather conditions that night were adverse, but not such as to cause the sinking of the ship. This finding therefore confirms what I previously argued through a series of technical, statistical, and engineering-based analysis, which I conducted and published via video presentations on my YouTube and LinkedIn channels. At this point, the question rightly arises of understanding how the ship sank if it was not due to weather and sea conditions. And so my thesis, as presented from the beginning, that of sabotage, is gaining ground. I also clarified that by sabotage I mean a pre-planned and well-organized military or paramilitary action aimed at sinking that ship in precisely that geographic location and with precisely that dynamic. In previous videos, I also demonstrated how a sinking dynamic was possible. I presented a physics-based study, and for those who don't remember it or haven't seen it, I'll include the link in the description and at the end of this video. Therefore, having finally cleared the weather issue, I'd like to continue explaining my hypothesis regarding the dynamics of the events, based on objective elements that can be verified by anyone. To do so, I'll draw on part of my previous study involving tank experiments with a ship model, and I'll also reference a video published by engineer Ugo Notaro in January 2025, in which he presents the AIS traces of the two vessels present that night in Porticello Bay, the Bayesian and Sir Robert Baden-Powell. From my previous study, I show you the short film in which I demonstrated a possible sinking dynamic for a ship with its bow tied with a chain to a locked anchor and a force exerting a pull on the upper end of the mast. Okay. Here I can provide a further detail of this experimental test. The end of the mast is pulled by a virtually invisible nylon thread. This shows the vessel's dynamics. The vessel rotates, moving its bow toward the pulling point. This dynamic is also explained in the physical model I presented in January this year. I can therefore relate this experiment to the Bayesian AIS trace. So, I show this slide in which I compare the screenshot of the model boat and the AIS trace of Bayesian vessel at one of the moments in the time slot corresponding to the sinking. It can be seen that at a certain point the Bayesian vessel has a rotation consistent with the one I obtained in the experimental simulation. I believe that this is the moment when the Bayesian vessel tilts on its side, begins to take on water from the upper deck, and is therefore the phase in which the survivors presumably had already descended into the lifeboat. This is then followed by the moment the Bayesian vessel sinks. Therefore, the subsequent AIS trace that engineer Notaro shows in his video, I believe it is the path the vessel follows during the sinking phase. This path. That is the phase in which the vessel, filled with the water and losing its ability to float, descends to the seabed, thus moving away from the point of the sinking due to its hydrodynamic shape. It then proceeds to submerge towards the bottom of Porticello Bay at a depth of about 40 meters. Clearly, once it reaches the bottom, the vessel lies on its side due to the weight of the mast, reaching a position of static stability. It therefore becomes necessary to review, in light of this consideration, the dynamics of the movement of the other ship on the bay. That is, the Sir Robert Baden-Powell. In light of this deduction, I can observe that the Sir Robert Baden-Powell remained stationary, or rather almost stationary, in the phases immediately preceding the sinking of the Bayesian, and then proceeded to reverse in the minutes immediately following. According to its captain, the schooner, the captain of the schooner, of the schooner Sir Robert Baden-Powell, uh, raised anchor and held the vessel with a bow, facing upwind and with the engine in forward gear to counteract the wind. Does not move backward, maintaining the same direction as the wind and against it, so as to remain practically in the same position due to the balance of forces. However, after the sinking of the Bayesian vessel, the Sir Robert Baden-Powell reversed toward the point of the sinking, perhaps because he saw the lifeboat's signal flares sent by the survivors. So this is the dynamic of the movements of the two vessels that I interpret in light of the new investigations. Indeed, I have further doubts about Sir Robert Baden-Powell's role in this sinking, but I cannot say beyond that. In summary, I would say that the newly established lack of weather condition likely to sink the Bayesian makes an investigation into the dynamics of the sabotage inevitable. It is absolutely obvious that in the absence of critical weather conditions, a vessel of that type, of that importance, with a history of navigation, anchored at a safe distance from exposed rocks and the pier, could only have sunk as a result of a well-planned and well-executed sabotage. And therefore necessary a sabotage operation carried out by a military or paramilitary force. It remains to be seen whether the possible roles and involvement of the actors present on the vessel, crew and guests, were significant, as is the role of other actors who operated under cover of the darkness, and particular weather conditions. Another issue that remains to be clarified is that while the AIS traces related to the two ships, it cannot be ruled out that there were other vessels in the sea that night. In other words, the presence of these two tracks does not mean that only those two vessels were present in that stretch of sea. It is worth noting that the AIS tracks were downloaded for those two specific vessels, which rightly had their AIS detection systems turned on. However, it cannot be ruled out that other vessels may have moved during these operations, which took place in the dead of night. Thank you for your attention.